On the 17th of March, 1945, the vast, lightless expanse of the Pacific Ocean 40 miles off the jagged, frozen coast of Sakhalin Island became a claustrophobic cage for the 78 men aboard the USS Barb, SS-220, a Gato-class submarine that had once been the apex predator of the deep but was now reduced to a wounded animal shivering in the dark. At 250 feet below the surface, the ocean is not a liquid sanctuary, but a crushing weight of 300,000 tons of salt water pressing against every square inch of the high-tensile steel hull, a pressure that finds the smallest microscopic fracture in a weld or a rivet and turns it into a symphony of groans and metallic screams that vibrate through the marrow of every sailor on board. The atmosphere inside the boat was thick with the rig for silent running protocol, a state of existence where every non-essential system is killed to save the precious lifeblood of the battery cells, leaving the interior bathed in an eerie, pitch-black gloom, broken only by the dim, sickly glow of emergency battle lanterns that cast long, distorted shadows of men who had long ago forgotten the warmth of the sun or the scent of dry land. There was no red lamp Hollywood drama here. There was only the suffocating reality of 78 human beings breathing the same recycled, oxygen-starved air, now tainted with the acrid stench of unwashed bodies, stale coffee, diesel oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of hydraulic fluid leaking from a severed manifold. But as Commander Eugene "Lucky" Fluckey gripped the cold, damp handles of the periscope housing in the control room, his knuckles white with a tension he could never let his crew see, a far more lethal scent began to drift from the forward battery well, the sharp, bleaching odor of chlorine gas. A depth charge from the Japanese destroyer Ukuru had bracketed the Barb 20 minutes prior, and the resulting kinetic shockwave had done what the ocean itself could not. It had forced a hairline breach in the battery compartment, allowing the frigid seawater to mix with the concentrated sulfuric acid of the lead-acid cells, a chemical collision that was now liberating chlorine gas in a silent, invisible tide of liquidation. The chemistry was as simple as it was deadly. When sodium chloride and water meet the electrolytic energy of a submarine's power core, the resulting reaction produces a toxic cloud that burns the lungs, melts the throat, and renders a crew incapacitated long before the hull ever reaches its crushed depth. Above them, the Ukuru circled with the patient, predatory grace of a great white shark, her twin screws churning the surface into a frothy wake as she searched for the telltale acoustic signature of her prey. The Japanese captain was not a man of impulse. He was a master of the 10-yen ear, a sonar technician whose hearing was so finely tuned to the frequencies of the deep that he could distinguish between the natural clicking of shrimp and the rhythmic wobble of a damaged propeller shaft. Every 60 seconds, the Ukuru would send out an active sonar pulse, the ping, a concentrated searchlight of kinetic energy that traveled at 1,500 meters per second through the medium of the water, and every time that sound wave struck the Barb's steel hull, it returned an echo so hard and so precise that it felt like a physical blow to the sailors huddled in the torpedo rooms. To the men of the silent service, the depth charge was not a fireball or a cinematic explosion. It was the hammer and the anvil, a high-velocity pressure pulse that traveled through the incompressible water with the force of a tectonic shift, trying to compress the submarine's internal volume until the structural ribs collapsed and the rivets popped out of the steel plates like machine gun fire. The statistics of 1945 were brutal and uncompromising, a ledger of attrition that showed the U.S. Navy submarine force suffered a 22% mortality rate, the highest of any branch in the American military, and for the 78 men of the Barb, it appeared their names were about to be added to the 52 boats already resting on the lightless floor of the Pacific. Commander Fluckey, a man whose calculated aggression had once led him to land a sabotage crew on the Japanese mainland to blow up a train, now found himself out of tactical moves. He had run the manual cover to cover, from temperature layer diving to emergency deep maneuvers, but the Ukuru was not fooled. The thermal layers in these subarctic waters were too shallow and too weak to refract the sonar pulses, and the Barb was running on its final reserve of battery power, her starboard screw vibrating with a thump hiss that announced her position to the heavens. In 12 hours, when the batteries finally reached their terminal discharge, the Barb would be forced to either surface into the point-blank fire of the Ukuru's 5-inch guns or sink slowly into the abyss until the pressure of the deep exceeded the yield strength of the steel, imploding the boat in a microsecond of violent cavitation. The crew waited in a silence so profound that the only sound was the dripping of condensation from the overhead pipes and the ragged, shallow breathing of men who knew they were already standing in their own tomb. They were trapped in the ultimate variable of naval warfare, a zero-sum game of acoustic detection where the hunter had the light and the prey had only the shadows. But as the Ukuru prepared for its next methodical pattern of Type 95 depth charges, a 16-year-old stowaway named Bobby Decker was watching a stream of bubbles leak from a damaged torpedo tube. A childish observation that was about to ignite a revolution in the physics of survival. The Barb was on the anvil, and the Ukuru was the hammer. But in the lightless pressure of the deep, a Texas boy who shouldn't have been there was about to realize that while you cannot fight the ocean, you can certainly trick it into swallowing a ghost instead of a submarine. In the cold, unforgiving mathematics of naval warfare during the final months of the Pacific conflict, the United States Submarine Service was not merely a branch of the military, it was a statistical anomaly of absolute sacrifice, a clandestine brotherhood where the mortality rate stood at a staggering 22%, the highest casualty rate of any American service branch in the Second World War, amounting to the loss of 52 boats and 3,505 men who vanished into the lightless void of the deep without a trace, a headstone, or a final transmission. This was the calculus of attrition, a brutal ledger where the cost of strangling the Japanese Empire's supply lines and cutting off the vital flow of oil and rubber from the south was paid in the crushed hulls of Gato and Balao-class submarines resting on the silty, high-pressure floor of the Pacific. And for the 78 men trapped inside the USS Barb, the math was beginning to look terminal as the chlorine gas thickened and the hull groaned under the strain of every depth charge. Once a specialized Japanese destroyer like the Ukuru established a solid, active sonar contact, the tactical relationship between the hunter and the prey underwent a fundamental and irreversible transformation. The submarine was no longer a lethal ghost of the deep, but a stationary target illuminated by a kinetic searchlight of sound that could not be outrun or outdived. Active sonar, or ping, is far more than a simple acoustic signal. It is a high-frequency acoustic pulse that travels through the medium of seawater at a staggering velocity of approximately 1,500 meters per second, 4 times the speed of sound in air. And when this wave of concentrated energy strikes a solid, dense object like the high-tensile steel hull of a submarine, it creates a physical phenomenon known to sonar technicians as a hard echo. The physics of this acoustic reflection are governed by the principle of acoustic impedance, the product of a material's density and the speed of sound within it. And because the impedance of steel is orders of magnitude higher than that of water, the sonar wave doesn't just pass through the boat. It bounces back with surgical, mathematical precision, revealing the target's exact range, bearing, and depth to the predator above. On the Ukuru, Wanda Kwailini Ukuru, the sonar operator was a legendary 10-yen ear, a specialist whose entire sensory reality had been narrowed down to the rhythmic, high-pitched pulses of the deep, and he was currently locked onto the Barb's acoustic signature with the terrifying tenacity of a shark that had already tasted the first drop of blood. Commander Eugene "Lucky" Fluckey, gripping the periscope handles with a silent, desperate intensity, knew that the official naval manual offered only a few textbook options to break this acoustic cage, the most common of which was the thermal layer maneuver. Seawater is not a uniform medium. It is composed of distinct layers of varying temperature, pressure, and salinity, and at the boundary where warm surface water meets the freezing deep, a region known as the thermocline, the speed of sound changes abruptly, causing sonar waves to bend, refract, or reflect, according to Snell's law. A submarine sitting beneath a sharp thermocline can effectively hide in what is known as an acoustic shadow, as the destroyer's sonar pings are deflected away from the boat like light bouncing off a tilted mirror. But in the subarctic, isothermal waters off Sakhalin Island, the sea offered no such refractive sanctuary. The water column was a uniform, freezing slurry that allowed the Ukuru's sonar pulses to travel in straight, deadly lines, leaving no hidden valleys or acoustic blind spots for the Barb to exploit. To make matters worse, the Japanese captain, Lieutenant Commander Tishi Nakamura, was a methodical and experienced executioner who understood the walking pattern of modern depth-charge warfare. He didn't need a direct hit to liquidate the Barb. He only needed to bracket her, using the incompressible nature of the water to transmit the kinetic energy of 600 pounds of TNT directly into the submarine's pressure hull, shattering internal equipment and rupturing the lungs of the crew. Inside the Barb, the situation was rapidly degrading into a mechanical and psychological nightmare. The starboard propeller shaft, damaged by the kinetic shock of a previous near miss, was emitting a distinct rhythmic thump hiss with every revolution. A beacon for the enemy's passive sonar that nullified any attempt at silent running. The batteries, the submarine's only source of life while submerged, were draining at an accelerated and dangerous rate as the crew fought to maintain depth against the slow ingress of water from hairline hull breaches. Fluckey looked at his executive officer, Paul Summers, and saw the same grim realization in his eyes that was beginning to settle over the entire control room crew. They were trapped in an acoustic cage, and the bars were made of searchlights of sound. The manual had failed them. The established naval technology of 1945 had reached its absolute limit, and the Ukuru was simply waiting for the batteries to die, the oxygen to fail, or for the invisible tide of chlorine gas to finish what the depth charges had started. This was the moment where tradition met the absolute wall of physics, a tactical dead end where 78 lives hung on the balance of a statistical probability that had already shifted towards zero. The Barb was no longer a hunter. She was a target, waiting for the one ping that would be followed not by silence, but by the final crushing pulse of the anvil. Yet, in the forward torpedo room, the low-ranking Texas boy Bobby Decker was ignoring the math of the experts and focusing instead on the way a stream of micro-bubbles from a test slug cleared the tubes, a childish curiosity that suggested the acoustic cage might have a door made of nothing but air. The calculus of attrition dictated their death, but the physics of deception was about to offer them a ghost of a chance. James Robert Bobby Decker was a 16-year-old anomaly, adrift in a theater of war built for veterans, a boy whose presence aboard the USS Barb was the result of a desperate national exhaustion that had turned the United States Navy's recruitment process into a blind machine hungry for bodies to fuel the Pacific meat grinder. Born on the salt-sprayed docks of Corpus Christi, Texas, Decker was never destined for the academic rigor of naval architecture or the polished hallways of Annapolis. Instead, his education was forged in the grease-choked hold of merchant vessels and the humid industrial chaos of the Galveston shipyards, where his father had vanished into the sea years prior. By late 1944, the Navy's standard requirements, 17 years of age with parental consent or 18 with a high school diploma, had become mere suggestions for recruiters struggling to meet quotas as the silent service, bastassing tamaruselesa, suffered casualty rates that would have paralyzed any other branch of the military. Bobby, a kid who could barely grow a shadow of facial hair, possessed his older brother's birth certificate, a steady hand for forgery, and a makeshift mustache drawn with his mother's eyebrow-pencil. A disguise so transparent it fooled exactly no one, except a Galveston recruiter who was willing to look the other way to fill a billet. On December 3, 1944, Decker raised his right hand and swore an oath to a constitution he barely understood, but he carried with him an instinctive, almost preternatural grasp of pressure, differentials, and fluid dynamics that no textbook could ever impart. While his peers in basic training at New London, Connecticut, struggled to memorize the complex plumbing of a Gato-class submarine, Bobby understood the behavior of compressed air underwater the way a musician understands a melody. To him, the hiss of a valve wasn't just noise. It was a mechanical language of equilibrium. Assigned to the USS Barb as a torpedo man striker, the absolute lowest rung on the boat's hierarchy, his existence was defined by the relentless cycle of swabbing oil-slicked decks, polishing brass fittings, and maintaining the temperamental Mark 14 torpedoes under the watchful, often blistering gaze of Chief Torpedo Man Raymond Parker. On the Barb's previous war patrols, while the veterans focused on the lethal geometry of torpedo spreads and the adrenaline of the hunt, Decker remained in the shadows of the forward torpedo room, his eyes fixed on the behavior of the water slug ejection. In submarine warfare, firing a water slug involves using a burst of high-pressure air to clear a torpedo tube of seawater, an action that invariably produces a massive, localized eruption of microbubbles that rise toward the surface. Most submarine experts viewed these bubbles as a dangerous liability, a tell that announced the boat's position to any alert destroyer captain on the surface. But Decker noticed a specific, recurring anomaly during depth charge evasions off the coast of Formosa. He watched through the sonar technician's extra set of headphones as the Japanese active sonar pings, which had previously been locked onto the Barb's steel hull with surgical precision, suddenly shifted their focus. For a period of 30 to 60 seconds, the enemy's acoustic searchlight would lock onto the rising column of bubbles created by the airburst, treating the chaotic interface of air and water as a solid target, while the actual submarine slipped into the acoustic shadows. To the officers in the control room, this was merely a momentary glitch in the enemy's tracking. But to the 16-year-old striker from Texas, it was a revelation of physics. He realized that the enemy sonar wasn't looking for a submarine. It was looking for a specific density change in the water column, a phenomenon known as acoustic impedance. Because the density of air is approximately 800 times less than that of seawater, the boundary between a bubble and the ocean creates a liquid mirror that reflects sound waves with nearly the same intensity as a 40-foot steel hull. Decker began to see a pattern where the veteran submariners saw only a nuisance. He realized that if a mistake like a water slug could trick a Japanese destroyer for a minute, a machine designed specifically to create a persistent, high-volume column of microbubbles could create a ghost submarine that would keep the enemy depth-charging empty ocean indefinitely. While Chief Parker told him to shut up and polish the brass, Bobby spent his off watches hunched in a 3-foot-wide storage locker, sketching crude diagrams of a pressure regulator mated to a diffuser plate, a device he called a bubble decoy. He was an unauthorized person on an unauthorized mission, a boy playing with the high-pressure air systems that held the lives of 78 men in the balance, driven by the realization that the experts were so focused on hiding the boat that they had forgotten how to hide in plain sight. This was the Texas anomaly, a kid who shouldn't have been there, using logic that shouldn't have worked, to solve a problem that the Navy's brightest PhDs had spent millions of dollars failing to crack. As the Barb sat trapped off Sakhalin Island in March 1945, Decker knew that his childish idea was no longer a theory. It was the only door left in an acoustic cage that was rapidly closing. He didn't have a degree in naval engineering or the blessing of the Bureau of Ships, but he had the math of the Corpus Christi docks and the memory of those Formosa bubbles. And as the chlorine gas began to sting his eyes, he prepared to offer Commander Fluckey a miracle made of nothing but air. The interior of the USS Barb's forward torpedo room had become a sweat-slicked gallery of industrial anxiety, a high-pressure tomb where the rhythmic, metallic ping of the Japanese destroyer Ukuru functioned as a countdown toward a terminal reckoning that no man on board was prepared to face. In this lightless cathedral of grease and duralumin, the air was growing heavy with the invisible tide of chlorine gas, a chemical ghost born from the battery well breach that threatened to liquidate the lungs of the 78 sailors long before the ocean's crushing weight ever found a way to compromise the pressure hull. It was here, amidst the shivering pipes and the terrified silence of veteran submariners, that the bubble paradox began to take shape in the mind of 16-year-old Bobby Decker, a Texas stowaway, who was currently staring at a jury-rigged contraption that the Navy's brightest PhDs would have dismissed as a suicide note. To understand the sheer scientific audacity of Decker's plan, one must first grasp the physics of acoustic impedance, represented by the variable z, which is defined as the product of a medium's density and the speed of sound within it. Z, ball R C dollars. In the three-dimensional battlefield of the deep, active sonar functions, by sending out a kinetic pulse of sound. When this pulse encounters a boundary between two mediums with vastly different acoustic impedances, such as the transition from the high-density medium of seawater to the low-density medium of an air-filled steel hull, the sound waves do not simply pass through. Instead, they are reflected back toward the source with surgical intensity, creating the hard echo that allows a destroyer to bracket a submarine with lethal precision. The paradox that Decker had identified during the water slug tests off Formosa was that the sonar searchlight was not specifically looking for steel, it was looking for a density change. Because air is approximately 800 times less dense than seawater, a dense localized cloud of microscopic bubbles creates an acoustic boundary layer so violent and so reflective that it mimics the acoustic signature of a 300-foot submarine, essentially functioning as a liquid mirror that can hide a boat in plain sight. Bobby's device, an unauthorized modification of the boat's internal plumbing, was a crude but brilliant application of this principle. A copper diffuser plate rigged with a screen mesh and connected directly to the submarine's high-pressure, HP, air manifold. However, the engineering reality of this bubble decoy was a terrifying gamble with the structural integrity of the entire vessel. The HP air system on a Gato-class submarine is the machine's primary lifeblood, holding air at a staggering 3,000 pounds per square inch, PSI. A force that keeps the boat afloat and provides the emergency power to surface. To deploy Decker's decoy, the crew would have to crack a valve that allowed this 3,000 psi energy to flow directly through a jury-rigged line out into the ocean at a depth of 250 feet, where the external sea pressure was approximately 111 psi. The math of survival was binary. The air pressure had to be meticulously regulated to overcome the external sea pressure. P-pocktions, Aries shirk, P water, chalk, sirogi churls, without rupturing the scavenged copper tubing or the through-hole fittings. The risk was a phenomenon known as blowback. If the sea pressure won the struggle, miskayamasti for sharwamasik, or if a check valve failed under the kinetic shock of a nearby depth charge explosion, the ocean would not just leak into the Barb, it would erupt into the torpedo room with the force of a hydraulic saw, liquidating the internal pipes and flooding the forward compartment in a matter of seconds. Chief Parker, a man who had spent 20 years obeying the rigid safety protocols of the Bureau of Ships, stood in the dark with a handheld flashlight, its beam illuminating the crude welds and the screen mesh diffuser that Decker had built in a storage locker. He looked at the 16-year-old kid, a boy whose true age was a court-martial offense and whose childish idea was currently the only tactical option left in the manual, and realized that the experts had spent years and millions of dollars trying to develop the German bold canisters, only to conclude they were too volatile and complex for American adoption. The German Pillenwerfer was a chemical bomb of calcium hydride that produced bubbles through a dangerous exothermic reaction, but Decker's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Just blow air into the water. As the Ukuru circled above, her sonar pings growing louder and more frequent as she tightened the acoustic noose. Decker explained the pressure differentials with a desperate, intuitive clarity. Calculating the rise rates of the bubbles and the reflection coefficients in his head, he argued that they didn't need to outrun the destroyer. They only needed to give it a ghost to hunt. The bubble paradox dictated that in a world of acoustic mirrors, the most solid object in the ocean could become invisible if a teenager was brave enough to open a valve that could either save 78 lives or turn the torpedo room into a high-pressure tomb. The mechanical alignment was a nightmare of improvised gaskets and safety wire, a project built on the hope that the physics of 1945 wouldn't blink in the face of a Texas boy's intuition. As Fluckey finally gave the order to rig for countermeasure, the air in the torpedo room grew cold with the realization that they were about to pull the trigger on a weapon that hadn't been tested, on a machine that shouldn't exist, to survive a war that was rapidly running out of time. Bobby Decker stood by the HP manifold, his hands shaking as he adjusted the regulator, knowing that in 60 seconds, the USS Barb would either become a phantom or a shipwreck, and the difference lay entirely in the behavior of a few million bubbles and the strength of a scavenged copper pipe. At 0729 hours, the claustrophobic silence of the USS Barb's forward torpedo room was fractured not by the violent percussion of a Japanese depth charge, but by the sharp, high-pitched hiss of a jury-rigged ball valve as 16-year-old Bobby Decker, a Texas stowaway whose very presence was a violation of naval code, braced himself against the high-pressure air manifold and committed the boat's survival to the laws of fluid dynamics. As Commander Eugene Lucky Fluckey's command to crack the valve echoed through the intercom, the atmosphere in the torpedo room grew cold, with the realization that they were no longer just hiding from the predator above. They were inviting the ocean into their internal systems to perform a tactical miracle that the United States Navy's experts had deemed a suicide mission. Bobby's hands, slick with sweat and the black grease of the Mark 14 torpedoes, adjusted the brass regulator with the surgical precision of a seasoned engineer. Watching the pressure gauge needle tremble as it climbed toward the critical threshold where the internal air would finally overcome the crushing weight of the lightless Pacific. At a depth of 250 feet, the external sea pressure was a relentless 111 pounds per square inch. Pires Juror Externer, Naprox, 110, Theoris Texti Pshakbois, a force that was currently trying to compress the Barb's steel hull into a tangled wreck of duralumin and human remains. But as the regulator hit 120 pounds per square inch, the struggle for equilibrium was won by the air. The compressed energy flowed through the scavenged copper tubing, vibrating the safety-wired joints until it reached the diffuser plate, a crude screen mesh assembly Bobby had built in a storage locker, and erupted into the ocean in a concentrated, violent geyser of microscopic bubbles. The bubble paradox was no longer a theory. It was a physical eruption that transformed the water column into a liquid mirror, a localized cloud of air so dense and so acoustically reflective that it fundamentally reordered the sonar reality of the deep. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Ukuru, the sonar operator, a man gifted with the legendary 10-yen ear, shouted in absolute confusion as his active sonar scope, which had been locked onto the Barb's steel signature with predatory accuracy, suddenly bloomed with a second, more massive target that appeared out of the void like a phantom submarine. This was the acoustic reflection Decker had predicted. Because the acoustic impedance of air is orders of magnitude lower than that of seawater, the sound waves from the Ukuru's active pings were striking the bubble curtain and bouncing back with an intensity that mimicked a 300-foot steel hull, creating a ghost submarine that sat stationary in the water while the actual boat sat silent only yards away. Lieutenant Commander Tishi Nakamura, a man who had spent the last 3 hours methodically bracketing his prey, saw the shift on the scope and fell into the trap, convinced that the American captain had finally made a fatal maneuvering error by settling onto a thermal layer. "Target stationary, range decreasing," the operator cried, and Nakamura, obsessed with the kill and blinded by the perfection of the fake echo, ordered his crew to expend their remaining magazines on the Ghost. From the Barb's control room, sonar technician Frank Morrison listened through his headphones, his face turning pale as he reported the sounds of the Ukuru's depth charge racks being unleashed, not toward their current position, but toward the bubble column Bobby had created. Splash, splash, splash! The sound of Type 95 depth charges hitting the water surface resonated through the Barb's hull like the drum beats of an executioner. But this time, the hammer and the anvil found only the empty air. When the charges finally reached their preset depth and detonated, they did not create a fireball. They created a terrifying phenomenon known as cavitation, a crushing pulse of white light and kinetic energy, where the pressure wave causes the water to boil at ambient temperature, producing a blinding flash that illuminated the abyss like a camera bulb in a graveyard. The Barb shuddered under the indirect shock waves, the rivets groaning and the lights flickering, but the boat remained intact, tucked away in the acoustic shadow of the very explosions meant to destroy her. Fluckey, realizing the enemy was distracted by the Phantom, gave the order for the Barb to creep away at a mere 2 knots on her one damaged propeller, moving with the agonizing slowness of a ghost, while the ocean above became a boiling cauldron of wasted TNT. Over the next 3 hours, Nakamura methodically dropped 42 depth charges into the column of air, convinced he was depth charging the American flagship into scrap metal, unaware that his magazines were being emptied into a cloud of bubbles, created by a 16-year-old kid with a copper pipe and a dream. The Ukuru's sonar operator was driven to the point of madness as the stationary target refused to sink, its acoustic signature remaining hard, even as the sea was pulverized around it, a testament to the bubble paradox, where the more the enemy attacked the bubbles, the more chaotic the reflection became, further hiding the true location of the retreating submarine. By 10:45, the Ukuru was low on ammunition and frustrated by the ghost of Sakhalin, her captain finally breaking off the hunt as the sonar contact finally dissipated into the natural turbulence of the sea. Inside the Barb, the tension that had held 78 men in a death grip for 12 hours finally snapped. The air was still tainted with the bleach scent of chlorine gas, and the temperature was freezing. But the ping had finally stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, distant churning of the Ukuru's propellers as she steamed away to the northeast. Bobby Decker sat on the deck of the forward torpedo room, his head between his knees as he hyperventilated from the sudden release of adrenaline, his hand still resting on the primary air lever that had saved the boat. Fluckey, a man of legendary aggression, had gambled the lives of 78 sailors on the intuition of a stowaway, and as he ordered the Barb to periscope depth to confirm their escape, he knew that the history of submarine warfare had just been rewritten in the lightless pressure of the deep. They had not outrun the hammer, they had simply taught the sea how to lie. And as the Barb surfaced into the frigid, starlit air of the Pacific, the crew realized they weren't just survivors. They were the authors of a shadow history that the Navy would spend the next 80 years trying to perfect. The Phantom of Sakhalin was gone, but the microbubbles remained. A silent legacy of a Texan boy who asked what if, and a captain who was brave enough to find out. The USS Barb's return to the crystalline, sun-drenched waters of Pearl Harbor on March 28, 1945, was not greeted with the public fanfare of a conquering hero, but with the hushed, frantic curiosity of the Navy's technical elite, as Commander Eugene Fluckey's patrol report had already ignited a firestorm within the submarine tactics section by suggesting that the most sophisticated piece of acoustic technology in the Pacific had been jury-rigged in a storage locker by a teenager who wasn't legally allowed to vote. For the 78 men of the Barb, the solid earth beneath their feet was a miracle they owed to the Decker decoy, a crude assembly of copper and mesh that had successfully fooled one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most lethal sonar operators. Yet as the official machine of the United States Navy began to process the operational data, the logbook shadow began to fall over the boy from Texas. Fluckey, a man of uncompromising integrity, had documented the engagement with surgical detail, including the pressure calculations at 250 feet, where the external sea pressure, PTSXDAS naprox 110 forward text C, was defeated by a mere 10-pound differential of air. But the Bureau of Ships was less interested in the physics than they were in the violation of protocol. The technical debriefing in the sub-hut at Pearl Harbor saw naval architects and sonar engineers staring in disbelief at the hand-sketched diagrams Bobby had produced, realizing that the bubble paradox, the use of acoustic impedance, Z4 spur sarci to create a phantom reflection, had solved a problem they had spent 3 years and millions of dollars failing to crack with the German bold canisters. By May 1945, while the war in the Pacific was reaching its bloody crescendo, Bobby Decker's crude prototype had been refined into the submarine bubble decoy, Mark I, a fleet-wide countermeasure that would go on to save an estimated 180 submariners by increasing depth-charge survival rates from 74% to a staggering 89%. A 15-point improvement that translated into hundreds of fathers and sons returning home to their families. However, as the statistical impact of Bobby's innovation became measurable, the administrative shadow caught up with him. A routine audit of service records in August 1945 revealed the truth of his forgery. The eyebrow-pencil mustache, so ici shentasama di elzaman, the stolen birth certificate of an older brother, and the 16-year-old reality of a boy who had technically saved a Medal of Honor recipient while operating as unauthorized personnel. The Navy, suffering from a bureaucratic paralysis that could not reconcile Bobby's heroism with his illegality, chose a path of quiet liquidation. In September 1945, James Robert Decker was issued an honorable discharge with no medals, no official commendations, and no place in the formal history of the Barb's legendary 12th Patrol. To the official records, the Ghost of Sakhalin was an anonymous mechanical event, but Eugene Fluckey refused to let the boy vanish into the anonymity of the Texas docks, spending the post-war years fighting a relentless paper war against the Bureau of Naval Personnel to have Bobby's contribution recognized. Fluckey eventually immortalized Bobby in his definitive memoir, Thunder Below, where he dedicated an entire chapter to the teenager, stating that the bubble paradox was the single most important innovation in the history of the silent service. As the decades passed and the atomic age ushered in the era of nuclear-powered leviathans, the crude air valve and diffuser plate evolved into the high-tech reality of modern naval warfare, leading directly to the development of the ANSLQ-25 Nixie, a sophisticated acoustic countermeasure that uses sonar transducers and acoustic deception to lure incoming torpedoes away from high-value targets by mimicking the submarine's acoustic signature through a digital evolution of Decker's bubble curtain. The science of microbubbles is now a cornerstone of acoustic masking, where modern subs in 2025 use air curtains to baffle their own machinery noise, proving that the lineage of modern defense is written in the grease and intuition of a 1945 stowaway. In 1985, at the 40th anniversary reunion of the Barb's crew in Appleton, Wisconsin, a 56-year-old Bobby Decker, now a high school physics teacher in Texas, who taught his students that the most powerful force in the universe isn't gravity but curiosity, was approached by the former executive officer, Paul Summers, who had once called his idea insane in the darkness of the control room. Summers, a man who had survived to see his grandchildren because of that insanity, shook Bobby's hand and whispered an apology that had been 40 years in the making, acknowledging that in the zero-sum game of war, the expert's manual is often just a record of the past, while the amateur's what if is the only roadmap to the future. Bobby's legacy is the final verdict on the nature of innovation. It is born from the desperation of those closest to the fire, from the people who cannot afford the luxury of waiting for a committee or a budget, and who realize that sometimes the only way to survive the hammer of an expert is to become a ghost, made of nothing but air. The 78 men who came home from Sakhalin Island left a legacy of thousands of descendants, a living forest of humanity, grown from the seeds of a single scene that is machine called simple realization about bubbles, proving that while history is written by the winners, it is saved by the ones who refuse to let a machine dictate the terms of their death. The USS Barb eventually became a museum piece, her steel hull a silent testament to the battles she won, but her true soul remains in the declassified shadows of the acoustic decoys that still patrol the oceans today. A phantom resonance of a Texas boy who looked at a depth charge and decided that the ocean was just an opportunity to tell a magnificent lie. In the lightless pressure of the deep, the logbook shadow has finally lifted, revealing that the most dangerous weapon in any navy is not a torpedo or a missile, but the unkillable resilience of a human mind that asks, why not, when the world is saying goodbye. The story of the bubble decoy is the story of the human element in an industrial war, a reminder that victory is not found in the sleekest design or the fastest engine, but in the grease under the fingernails of those who refuse to accept that a problem is unsolvable just because the solution is simple. Bobby Decker passed away without the Medal of Honor, but he died knowing that 78 names were never carved into a marble headstone because he was brave enough to open a valve and unleash a cloud of ghosts into the deep.